Good evening, and welcome to the third annual Phil Patton Memorial Lecture. My name is Molly Heinz, and I'm the chair of the Design Research, Writing, and Criticism Master's Program at the School of Visual Arts. Yes, thank you. Students who want to get good grades. We're so happy to have you with us this evening, and thank you so much for coming. We are thrilled to have had such a great response to tonight's event, and I want to say a warm hello to our live stream audience watching us remotely. And because of the overwhelming response to this evening's program, we had to move quickly to find a bigger venue when the ticket sales started to exponentially increase. And so I want to start off with some thank yous. First, a big thank you to the SVA theater staff who worked to get us on their schedule. And next, a big thank you to Adam Harrison Levy, whom I'll introduce you to a little bit more in a moment, who helped organize our speakers this evening. A gigantic thank you to our event producer and our director of operations in the program, Eric Schwartel, who is responsible for pulling everything together this evening. And finally, a big thank you to our graduate student helpers from the class of 2018 who checked you in and are making sure this event is running smoothly. And I also, as an aside, want to invite you to come see them on May 8th at their thesis symposium, which has the working title Reframe, Rephrase, and Refract at Scandinavia House at 6:30 p.m. on Tuesday, May 8th. So hope you'll come back for that. So normally we are operating on a slightly smaller scale back here at our studio on West 21st Street. And if you haven't been to events in our space before or don't know about our program, we are a one-year graduate program focused on the study of design, its contexts and consequences. And I think what distinguishes SVA and our program in particular is the faculty, most of whom are not just excellent teachers, but also acclaimed practitioners who are at the top of their game professionally. From the prolific Steve Heller, who is a co-founder of our program, to writer and critic Carrie Jacobs, who's here in the audience tonight, to Robin Pogreben, whose byline you can see regularly in the New York Times. It's truly an honor to work with such an outstanding group. You can find out more about our faculty and about our program in general on our website. And there you'll also find information about scholarships in our program and about how to apply. We're currently accepting applications on a rolling basis for the class of 2019. And all the latest news is on our homepage. And I'd like to bring your attention to one upcoming program in particular, which is our 2-week summer intensive. It's a residency program focused on research and writing about design, and that will happen this year between June 4th and June 15th with many of our regular faculty plus out-of-towners like journalist Rob Walker. Our priority deadline for first consideration is coming right up on April 1st, so go check it out on our website, and you can also, if you're interested, pick up an application on the table just around the corner as you walk out the door. And let's see, now to the reason we are here this evening. Phil. Phil Patton was a journalist and critic who wrote about the design of everyday life in numerous books and a variety of publications, but he may be best known for his long-running column in the New York Times, where he covered cars and car culture. And some of you are here tonight because you knew Phil as a colleague or a teacher. He was a key faculty member for our program in design criticism from the time it launched in 2008. Phil taught a seminar called Typologies at SVA that I can honestly say changed the way many of his students see the world. And to honor Phil's memory every year, around the time of his birthday, March 23rd, we established the Phil Patton Memorial Lecture, which takes a central spot in our spring lecture series and is delivered by a special guest or guests whose work resonates with Phil's own research and writing. And tonight, we are thrilled to have two distinguished speakers whom I think represent Phil's quest to question why things look the way they do and why things are the way they are. And I want to say thank you to Phil Patton's family. His wife, Kathleen, is with us this evening in the audience, and our department thanks them because we are the recipient of a priceless gift, Phil's archive. And we have been at work cataloging it and have been uncovering some amazing things. Last year at this event, I think I showed the original press kit for Next Computers, whose brand identity was designed by the legendary Paul Rand. And just a couple of weeks ago, we uncovered this cache of amazing mail order catalogs, including the original Banana Republic catalog, which is pretty cool, and just representative of Phil's dedication to studying the everyday and finding the magic and what is extraordinary in that. And it's also represented in this book, Top This and Other Parables of Design. If you're not familiar with his writing, this is a great little book to pick up. It was published by the Cooper Hewitt a couple of years ago and has some of his best articles. And also, Phil is represented by what his students got to cover in his fantastic typologies course at SVA, from the design of mousetraps to the grades of nail ornament. And, of course, coffee cup lids. Phil liked to ask questions, and we wanted to invite speakers this evening who also operate in that same spirit. But we also wanted to bring in a questioner to question the questioners. And that is Adam Harrison Levy, who is a writer, interviewer for BBC documentaries and a contributor to Design Observer. He's also a faculty member in our program and teaches a course on interviewing and archival research. And I'm going to turn the rest of the program over to Adam, if you'd like to come up.
I just want to add one more thanks, which is to Molly, our steady and calm leader who keeps everything on track. So thanks, Molly. So tonight, as the numbers attest, I think is going to be thought-provoking, stimulating, and definitely sparkly, given our speakers. The first speaker is Natasha Jen. Natasha is an award-winning designer. She's been part of Pentagram since 2012, and she's a 3-time National Design Award nominee. And her innovative work challenges conventional notions of media and cultural contexts. And she's a faculty member at the School of Visual Arts and a guest critic at Harvard Graduate School of Design and the Yale School of Art. Khoi Vinh, who's going to be responding to Natasha's comments, and we're all going to have a conversation, is the principal designer at Adobe, where he's charged with aligning Adobe's design initiatives more closely with its customers, its partners, and its community. Previously, he was the design director at the New York Times, and he writes a widely read blog on design and technology at subtraction.com. So, tonight, the way it's going to work is that Natasha is going to give the featured Phil Patton Memorial Lecture, and then Khoi is going to give a parallel presentation. And we're hoping there'll be lots of interconnections and hopefully some divergences as well, which will be then hashed out in a kind of friendly but hopefully slightly friction-led conversation on the main stage, which I'll moderate. And then afterwards, we'll do a Q&A. And not to get too meta, but think of this as Natasha doing a presentation and Khoi sort of being the master critic coming in at a graduate school level and being the sort of respondent, and then all of us are everyone else in the room. So it's that kind of dynamic. So without anything more to say, without further ado, Natasha.
Hi, everyone. Hi, everyone. Good evening. Well, first of all, thank you so much for being here, and thank you to those who are on the other side of the wherever. I want to thank to Molly and Adam and DCrit for having me and organizing this incredible event together. So I'm going to start. Designer as critic. So this is sort of like this is a theme. This is not a affirmative statement. So we're gonna center our conversations tonight around this theme. But before I get into to this idea that designer being critic, there are a couple questions that I just want to answer and clear it away. First question: should designers be design critics? My answer is no. Why? I know that this is sort of, against the notion of designer being critic, but I guess the answer really depends on your definition on what a critic should be and what a critic's role is. And my definition on a critic, and any kind of critic, is that first of all, it really requires some really special intellectual rigor to be a critic. And as a professional critic, it's not something that everyone can do, and that's not something that every designer can do or should do. The other thing also is that I think, designers are makers. We create things, we make things, and critics, they're observers. They assess the work that the makers make. So there's this kind of, tension between a critic and a maker, and that is not a really easy relationship. So here you're seeing on the left, they're the two my two favorite art critics, Roberta Smith and her husband Jerry Saltz. On the right, you see one of my favorite artists, Jeff Koons. They're all really great, and I admire their work incredibly. But Jerry has been, a little harsh on Jeff Koons at times, and Jerry is an incredible writer. His writing is filled with wisdom and intellect and wit as well. So here you see that he was not, he was pretty unforgiving on some of the work, especially some of the work that Jeff Koons has created, especially like his place in art history. But then, Jeff's response was, well, you don't get it, man. So here you see that, the makers could be a genius, but there's that kind of, the closeness, not only to your own work, but also to the field itself, that I think is not healthy, for a maker to function as a critic. And then, second question, should designers be critical of design? The answer is we already are. So here you see two screen grabs. They're both reactions or, criticism to my work and my team's work. On the left, it was a series of comments to an identity that we designed 2 years ago for a cultural organization. Some were pretty, unforgiving, but some were sort of defending, our design. Great. And then on the right, you see that this is a screen grab on Pentagram's Instagram for one of the recent work that we uploaded. And as you can see that it was all really, really positive, lots of hearts and likes, great, So, these forms of expressions and, comments, despite that they're very, very simple and, oftentimes simple, and they're getting shorter and shorter. In a way, they're criticism already. So designers were always commenting, on social media very actively. So in a way, we're already doing that. So the question is, what's actually really missing in our practice, and also as a group of professionals? My view on this is that I think that we talk a lot, and we dialogue a lot on social media, and also we're very used to just commenting on things now out of our phones. But I think that one thing that I feel is missing is a kind of a sense of skepticism, from designers. And I'm gonna kind of dive into it a little bit. So I think that the digital platform provided this incredible opportunity for us to make our voice heard, but yet at the same time, we don't really choose the platforms, or even, you know, the format through which we react with, right? So you kind of see a condition that is that we tend to just kind of resort to the things that are provided to us without actually really questioning it, you know. And here is not necessarily, criticizing anyone here, but you see that this kind of really incredibly reduced form, you know, of looking at design is very kind of, common nowadays, you know, down to that we can just basically click on a button, you know, one out of the three things, is it awesome or is it really bad? And then that is sort of the design criticism that we have right now. And I haven't actually seen like much skepticism from designers about these, you know, platforms and mediums and, blogs and, channels that are kind of provided to us. I haven't seen much of that yet. But then I think that, if we look around into other adjacent fields, we see that, like in art, what's really interesting is that artists, not that all artists are critics, but artists as a field, I think that they tend to just be a lot more reflective, reflective not only on their own work, and in these artist writings, these are some of my favorite books written by artists. In their writing, you see that they really reflect and on their own work, and they're skeptical about what they're doing, oftentimes, and they're also very skeptical and question the world around them. And that's something that I think that we can do actually a lot more as designers. And I know it's not really an easy thing to do, just because a lot of our practice is to serve certain commercial, right, goals and purposes. So again, under that kind of condition, it's not that easy to really kind of reflect on, okay, are we doing the right thing, or are we doing good design right now? And I know that is not easy, but I think that we should actually strive to do a lot more reflection as a group. So, I would like to propose the idea that, that designer as skeptic. And I know that, skepticism is not necessarily a really kind of, encouraging and, positive word. But I think that it really opens up the ability for us to actually question things around it. And I think that, it also asks us to kind of think about a cultural and attitude shift that needs to happen. So I'm going to talk about certain shifts that I think that I would like to see to happen. And the first one is to actually shift sort of our obsession on prescription to exploration. I'm going to talk about that a little bit. So when I say prescription, I'm using this diagram as one of the examples. I gave a talk on design thinking and my issues with design thinking earlier last year at 99U, and got a lot of responses, good and bad. And I think that my biggest, issue, yes, with design thinking and also with the kind of general cultural condition right now, is that I think that we really crave prescriptions and methodology, in general, as a profession, also as a society. And that sort of probably explains, the proliferation of design thinking. You begin to see that these prescriptions really create a kind of prison, in my mind, in terms of how we can possibly think about things and how we can possibly work. And these images, they're not new, and we have seen these, perhaps even in our own practice, right? Very commonly. But the issue with a very kind of linear methodology-based way of working is that it completely removes other possibilities. And also one thing that I think is interesting to mention is that, okay, with 3M posters, you can do a lot of very quick brainstorming and collaborations, right? But the problem is that if you actually just really kind of look at what's on the stickers, they're all just thoughts from our heads, right? So again, that I think is really questionable because it again immediately removes a lot of the other possibilities and materials that you can actually you can probably bring in to actually really enrich the discussion. So from prescription, I would like to kind of go back to some of the kind of old ways of working. And I think that is not just, going back to old medium, but rather is the idea of, going back to the very notion of explorations. And here you see an image of the legendary Eames working in their studio. So the first thing that you notice is all the stuff that they have in their studio. And of course, that was before, the internet and computer came about. But what's very interesting, and I think, and special about their way of working is that they're just really curious about everything around them, and they actually collect everything possible. So it was really through their genuine interest in the world around them and through exploration, they were able to actually develop these incredible, body of work that if you actually look at this body of work from today's, lens, you would find them actually really crazy. Like, how is that even possible? And why would they actually do that? There's like no focus whatsoever, right? But I think that, if you actually put the kind of business focus aside, what's really inspiring is that they actually translate their exploration directly into their work and created this incredible body of work that is still inspiring us today. Okay, second thought, democratizing design. I think that we have, entered this age of democratization of design for years now, for several years now. With the assumption that by democratizing design, we're able to actually create better design. I don't think that. I will actually propose a different idea that's what I call cross-pollination between domains. And I know that this is a little, complicated to explain. I'm gonna dive into each. So first thing is this word empathy, is something that is really, prevalent in design discourse and a dialogue today. And even, I've seen people have become like experts on design empathy. Back in the day, we call it research, right? It's just like it's just part of your research. You listen to your audience, you understand what their needs are, but right now it's really this thing, empathy. But I think that it's not that I'm against empathy, we as designers, yes, we really need to empathize with our audience, and now we call them users. But I think that there's also this assumption right now with the word empathy that empathy equals we should just give people the pencil and let them actually design, because we really have to create this kind of user-centric, solution. And I'm sure you hear that, on a day-to-day basis. And again, I think that it's too simplistic to actually draw that equation. Being empathetic to your audience or users equates actually giving them the ability to tell you how to design, or actually dictate or even drive how you design. And I want to kind of, bring out a historic example. This is really an interesting case. And I got to know this project when I was at SVA, like I think in 2000 or 2001, through my art class. So here you see the artists. Their names are Komar and Melanit, and they work as pairs, and each of them has his own body of work. So in early 90s, they had this idea. They just wanted to know what a true people's art would look like. This, I think, is the only and perhaps the largest scale of user research in art ever. So they created this project that's called the Most Wanted and Least Wanted paintings. How did it do that? So this was before, the internet came about. So they couldn't actually put up, an online survey and, send it out to millions of people. Didn't have Facebook at that time. So what I did was that they literally traveled to these countries. There are 14 countries that they traveled to. And you see from the list, they're culturally actually quite different, with the majority being in Europe, but America is also on the list. So they really wanted to find out, okay, out of each country, first of all, what would their most wanted painting look like, and as well as least wanted. Okay, so they did this survey. They just questioned, a group of people. And sorry, I don't remember the exact number of people that they actually questioned. So on the right is basically the survey list. On the left is basically zoom in on some of the questions that they ask. And these questions look very similar to the questions, or to the level of simplicity of questions that we will ask our users today, right? So what colors do you like? Do you like warm color or cool color? So on and so forth. So they actually aggregated all the answers and began to actually, put it into some sort of tendency. So this is one of the charts that I created out of one of the answers. Do you like to see colors blended into each other, or you like to see them separate, right? So in America, the answer was predominantly blended color. Great. So out of these answers, they started to actually just realize the paintings. So here we go. This was America's favorite painting. You see, it's a very classic landscape, with foregrounds that have people on it, and two deers on the right with a tree in the foreground, little hill on the left, and then a lake, and then more mountains in the background. Great, that's America. But then, in France, they had some pretty similar results, with the exception that there's some haystacks in the foreground. But there's also that tree, and there's a lake, and there's a mountain in the back, and there are two deers. Iceland, oh my goodness, is almost the same, right? Compositionally as well as thematically. So it gets even more weird as we go along. Kenya, all right. I think in the middle is actually Jesus Christ. And we got a hippo on the right, great. So, it is really, really astounding that, first of all, not only how similar they are in terms of themes, in terms of objects and items and, compositions, but I think what's more astounding to me is that how generic they are. Right, and I think that this is very kind of enlightening study, in that not all user feedback is good, and oftentimes user feedback is the bottom line, and we should strive to actually do better than that. So what I would like to propose is, as I said previously, this idea of cross-pollination between different domains. And you may say, what does that mean? It simply means that, designers should actually really get into other areas of not just design, but just basically other domains that are typically outside of our own comfort zone. One interesting example for me is this architecture group in the 60s in London called Archigram. So Archigram was a group, a very small group of architects, and they never got anything realized, and that was not their agenda to get their thinking built. But what they were trying to do is to really agitate modernism, which again, was on the rise at that time. So what I wanted to do is to, first of all, create a kind of medium that is very unconventional in the architecture realm. So they chose the medium of a zine, okay? So these were actually the first three issues that they produce. And they're really interested in issues such as, technology and architecture, mobility, modularity. So they would propose things like the whole city can move, things like that. But these are some, examples from their really large body of work. And as you can see here, none of this is a kind of traditional architecture drawing, right? These are so exuberant and stylistically diverse that they're just really inspiring to look at. And you don't even have to be an architect, to actually enjoy, these images that they, collages mostly, that they created. And what I found most fascinating is this issue. This is issue 4, where they completely borrowed the language of Marvel comics, and they actually just use it as is, but the content was their original content. And I find that clash and also that cross-pollination really, really interesting. And that I find that kind of, thinking is really missing in our field of design right now. Everything feels really sterile and, safe right now. So, so I would like us to kind of really get out of our comfort zones and get into other domains. Next thing, I think that we live too much with jargon, and I think that we're also responsible for creating a lot of jargons, both in design thinking and also in branding. There's tons of jargon. So I think that, we really have to shift our focus from jargon to vocabulary, okay? Again, old school vocabulary. I think that you can't have any meaningful or deeper conversation unless you have a really rich set of vocabulary. Case in point, so these are some words that we gathered from, from a language that you see in design thinking. Again, it's a list, right, of jargons, and most of them are either confusing or, they don't mean much at all. And then I think that, given that design thinking itself, I think, really lacks vocabulary, you begin to see very, very simple terms, be verbs or, adjectives, are just constantly used, and there are just a handful of these words. They're just being used over and over and over again to talk about design thinking, such as, the word unleash, right, or unlock, right? You hear these two words quite often, in that school of thought. And I find that, problematic, because again, design itself is not just like, you're letting go this beast and it's gonna go save the world, right? Design is just a lot more nuanced, but because of a lack of a vocabulary, we begin to see these really, simplistic words being used over and over again. But I think that the lack of vocabulary has real consequences in the world, not just on paper. So this is an example about the MRA room for MRI room for children. As you know, it's a pretty terrifying experience, right, for kids to actually go through these machines, for adults even. So, so what we're trying to do is to figure out how can kids enjoy such an environment and experience more. So the solution was to create, a lot of cartoons, right, and just plaster them around the wall, around the whole machine, basically. That's great. I think the intent is really great. I think the departure point is really, really wonderful and honorable. But I think that the solution and the execution is really terrible. There's just so many things here that I think can be questioned, not just something that's as simple as putting, kids' graphics on all the surfaces, but it's about the dimension of this room. It's about the ceiling height. It's about the lighting. It's about the textures. It's about all the other things that you can actually see in graphics, and that really requires a great interior designer or architect to answer these questions. And again, once you bring in these experts, you begin to have a deeper vocabulary to critique this design. So again, I think that the lack of design vocabulary is an issue that we really have to address as an industry. Another shift is something that I think is pretty obvious, is the shift from the culture of boot camp to culture of learning. And we don't need to explain what learning is really about, where it actually requires a different lecture to talk about like learning today, right? So boot camp, I think boot camp culture is just so prevalent right now that is a little bit scary, because we have very quick and easy access to pretty much everything through digital means. And you begin to see that design education is now, being packaged as this, from 3-day boot camp to like a 3 months, quick thing. And once you walk out, you become an expert. And this is a screen grab of Stanford's design thinking program. And if you really look into it, it's quite insane, from the language of it to the image behind it, So there's just so much stuff that's actually really wrong with this. But then you see that this culture is not exclusive to very one or two specific schools. It actually has become a movement that I think is pretty terrifying. You see like schools and now even high schools begin to put out a 3-day design thinking boot camp. So I think that we really need to think a little more about that. Next thing, so innovation. Okay, so we have been in the era of innovation. You hear about innovation. There are people whose title is, the chief something of innovation. So it's really something that I think as a society and as a culture that we, not only that we crave, we actually look at it as this kind of singular thing, right? So, but I think that innovation itself actually doesn't really look back into history. It looks very much at the moment now. I think that betterment is perhaps a better way to think about things and think about our relationship to the world that we're living in right now, and also our relationship to the planet itself. So this is just really quick, and small collection of the word innovation, specifically in relationship to design thinking that I have gathered, So again, there's this kind of false promise that design thinking guarantees innovation, But like I said, I think that the notion of innovation, again, innovation is different from invention, You can invent something, but if you actually fail to bring it to market, that is not innovation. Innovation is really that process from inventing something that's actually pretty great to bringing it to the market and to mass adoption. That is innovation, right? But I think that, again, all these tools that we're in love with and we actually rely on many of them. And I'm not saying that these are all like examples of innovations. And I'm not saying that these are bad. They're great. But it's just that if we're actually just looking at right now, you begin to kind of fail to look back or look forward. So, these great, e-products, again, we, result in incredible problem in e-waste. And then now it's not just e-waste, it's basically pollution of all kinds, plastic, as well. Plastic was an innovation back in the day, so was atomic bomb, right? That just really changed the game of warfare. So again, if you just focus only on innovation, you actually fail to actually look at history and also what we can learn from history. So now, like, in the last 2 weeks, we're just so angry at Facebook, through this whole expose of Cambridge Analytica. So, there's this movement right now, delete Facebook. But I think that, delete Facebook is really not the solution here. Again, we're very angry at Facebook right now, and so am I. But I think that deleting Facebook is, again, a symptom of looking at just right now. Social media is not going to go away. Invasion on our privacy or, in personal data is not going to go away. Delete Facebook is not going to change anything, right? So it's really not a question about taking away social media. We might as well just take down the internet, right? It's about how we can actually use it, how we can actually regulate it, so that it can actually serve us better. Last thing. I would propose that we go from a society now obsessed with how things work, that is functionalism, to actually craft. Okay, I think there's profound difference in these two, right? We definitely want things to work. So this is a quick screen grab from the professor Brett Waters. I don't know him. He teaches at Stanford on about design thinking. So he wrote this piece titled "Design Thinking is Not About Design," and that caught my attention. I was like, well, then what is that about? Okay, so design thinking is an engineering methodology, according to Mr. Waters. For developing successful products, design thinking has nothing to do with making something pretty and everything to do with making something useful. For example, an engineer could use it to develop an ugly machine that does its job beautifully. I think this statement really fails to recognize the importance of beauty and how beauty is actually intelligence, is rigor, is culture. It actually embodies, so much more of us people than sheer functionalism. So these are two pieces. They're, dresses created by this Dutch designer, Aris van Harpen. And you see that, there's nothing about them that look like normal clothes, like, the jeans and t-shirts that you and I wear. And there's something so spectacular about them that you question its usefulness. They may not be useful, but when you actually see the incredible craft and kind of use of material and technology to actually create these things that almost look like some ancient artwork, from ancient culture, So there's something that's actually really inspiring in that, And the other example here is the Aspen Art Museum, designed by the Japanese architect Shigeru Ban. So you see that the facade itself is basically this woven sort of basket looking facade, but the technology and material actually required to do this is actually really, really difficult. So it's actually, the material is actually a combination of paper and a little wood with resin to actually build this. It is fireproof and it is incredibly strong. But so it works, right? And it's also like, really advanced in terms of this technology, just thinking about how you're going to actually weave these things, these pieces together so that it's actually structurally sound, but it's also, incredibly beautiful. So I think that this, dichotomy between functionalism and, beauty, something that actually works versus something that's just pretty, I think that should be completely dissolved because it's not serving us any good. Last thing, so I just want to end my my talk with this lecture, this interview by Steve Jobs, in the early 90s. I think a lot of the things that he's going to say here actually echoes or resonates, with my own thinking, and I find it actually quite entertaining. And Steve Jobs, he's got very interesting things to say. I'm just gonna play it here. That's it. Thanks.
Okay, wow. That was great, Natasha. Thank you so much. It's really an honor to be here, taking part in this Phil Patton event. It's what a wonderful legacy he left behind. Thanks to Molly and to Adam for inviting me. I was really flattered to be invited. And it's such an honor to follow Natasha. I've been a fan for a number of years, and I thank you for your address and your comments. I'm going to try my best to live up to them. I should confess, though, that I'm at a little bit of a disadvantage for 2 reasons. I was asked to respond to Natasha, and maybe offer a kind of counterpoint. So the first reason that I'm at a disadvantage is I actually agree with a lot of what you had to say. The second reason I'm at a disadvantage is I didn't get to see this wonderful talk beforehand. So all I had to go on was the 99U talk that you mentioned from last year, where I think you buried the lead because the title of that talk was Design Thinking is, I'm just going to say BS, but that's not exactly what you said. It's a wonderful talk, and I encourage everybody to take a look at it. So a lot of these remarks are actually a response to that, but I do think there's some interesting intersections. So I'm just going to dive into it. So first, I'll say that my point of departure with design thinking is that I could kind of take it or leave it. I think there's actually some interesting things about it. I think it helps a lot of people be creative in a way that they wouldn't be able to otherwise. But I also acknowledge that it really has a lot of downsides. It can be very superficial, as Natasha showed. It can be very misleading, and the outcomes that it produces can be disappointing. It can lead to bad design. And I think that concept of bad design, I just want to hang on to that just for a moment and come back to it later. But I do think that design thinking, it does offer a useful lesson on how we as designers think about democratization of our craft, which is something that you mentioned earlier. Before I get too deep into that, though, I want to talk about technology and engineering, because it's very difficult to talk about design absent a discussion of technology and engineering. And this isn't going to be quite an apples to apples comparison, because engineering is quite broad and big, and design thinking is kind of a narrow slice of design. It's certainly not all of design. But nevertheless, I think if you think about engineering as a proxy for discussing design, it's actually quite useful. So I'd just like to take a quick poll of the audience. How many people here know how to code? Okay, great. So a decent number of you. For those who didn't get trained in the traditional way, like attending a computer science program, for those of you who taught yourselves or maybe went out and got some extracurricular instruction, you know that there's really no shortage of educational resources that will teach you how to code. There's the For Dummies books, just like there's woodworking for dummies. There's also JavaScript for dummies. There's C for dummies. There's a ton of those titles, right? Those are still around. You could go to a place like Khan Academy online, and you can learn online all these rich resources available for you online. I keep forgetting to advance this. I'm sorry. Apple has a great product called Swift Playgrounds, which is an app. It's actually an environment that teaches children how to code. And I think that's really, really interesting. In fact, the way Apple talks about teaching people how to code, teaching kids how to code, is through a message like this. This is from the Apple website. It says, everyone can code. And that idea that everyone can code, I think, is really interesting in itself. First, it implies that there's going to be a lot of coding going on if everybody can code, right? There's going to be a lot of good code, but it also implies that there will be a lot of bad code. There will be bad code as a consequence of the democratization of engineering. But the thing is, I think engineering as a discipline, as a trade, as a profession, they're largely untroubled by this. They're largely unthreatened by the idea of bad code. It doesn't bother them that there's a lot of people out there writing bad code. In fact, it helps elevate the value of the good code. So you could say, in a way, that the prevalence of bad code has been a boon to the world of engineering, has been a boon to the craft of engineering. And it's because it means that engineering has been very widely distributed. It's everywhere, and so it's helped establish a cultural comfort with the processes of engineering, with its tools, and with its vernacular. This is also very important, with the vocabulary of engineering, because we all speak engineering now, right? And I'm not just talking about gigabytes and megahertz and RAM, the terms that we've become used to using in order to describe technology. I'm also talking about terms like reboot and bandwidth and offline and beta. These are all terms that we use in everyday life now. Even numbers which theoretically have no meaning. If I say 1.0 to you or 2.0, those have a meaning that are derived directly from their origins in technology. So you could say that really bad engineering has played a huge role in turning technology into one of the most powerful forces for change in the 21st century, for better or for worse. And you could also say that it's true that engineering has been incredibly democratized, and this has been good for engineers. You don't really see engineers out there worried about not getting paid enough. You don't see engineers out there being worried about not getting enough opportunities. There's a huge thirst for engineering talent out there, for good engineering talent. And yet, design and designers, I'm a designer myself, and what I've seen is that we are perpetually distressed, perpetually feel threatened by the idea of democratization. As long as I've been a designer, there's been talk about the idea of accreditation, about the idea of licensing designers, about making people go take training, take tests in order to practice design, regulating the practice of design. Designers take a look at services and websites like 99 Designs, which is a website. It's a marketplace. If you have a design task that you need done, a business card or something, you post it there, and then designers bid on the job. And the effect is that it drives down the price of design, drives down the median value of design. And then for years, we've talked about spec work, about the practice of doing free work in order to win a bigger opportunity to get paid work. And this is an argument that has some merit, but also the way that designers have talked about it is sometimes it seems so spiteful. It strikes me like we're like the rich 1% who are incensed by the idea of social services. So when I hear about this backlash against design thinking, it sounds to me a bit like territorialism. It sounds to me a bit like designers protecting our turf. This is the definition of design thinking that Natasha put in front of the 99U audience last year. I'll just read it really quickly. Design thinking packages a designer's way of working for a non-designer audience by codifying their processes into a prescriptive, step-by-step approach to creative problem solving, claiming that it can be applied by anyone to any problem. Now, I know this is not the intention here, but the unmistakable implication, at least for me here, is that only designers can do design. Maybe also only designers should be doing design. Now, to explain this, I'm going to go a little bit deeper into my analogy of design and engineering and technology. Some of you may be familiar with a book by Eric Raymond called The Cathedral and the Bazaar. This is a really foundational text of the idea of open source technology, open source software, which is actually arguably the ultimate expression of democratization in modern technology. And the basic concept of the book is that, there's a cathedral model where technology, where software is the domain only of experts, of developers. And you think about early technology in the 60s and 70s. In order to do any kind of computing, you had to drive there or take the bus. You had to go to a computing center, and you had to be allowed by the priests of technology to take part in technology. Now, the opposite is the bazaar model, where software, technology, it's iterated on in public. It happens everywhere. Everyone is able to participate. And this is the reason why we all have these supercomputers in our pockets or on our wrists or in our earbuds now. Because we have this idea that technology doesn't need to be kept by gatekeepers necessarily. So, this particular part of the definition, claiming that design thinking claims that it can be applied by anyone to any problem, this reminds me of that tension between the cathedral and the bazaar. And when we listen to arguments about the sanctity of design as a cathedral or the fallacy of the design bazaar, I think it's really important to remember that The fact of the matter is that there has long been an economic incentive for designers to shroud design in secrecy, to promote designers as genius inventors, Charles and Ray Eames or Steve Jobs even, as priests of the cathedral of design. Designers, to some extent, we want design to be an exclusive domain. We want the process to be mysterious because it preserves the perceived value of design. The thinking is that the more difficult design seems, the rarer good design seems, the more the good designers will be able to charge for it. But thinking back to the cathedral and the bazaar, if you have an idea like technology, you have a force of nature like technology, it becomes most powerful when it's democratized, when it gets out there in the world. And I really believe design is just like technology in this respect. Any embrace of design by non-designers, and I think design thinking qualifies here, any embrace is a good thing because it means that our language, the language of designers, is broadening to the rest of the world. And this is important because relatively few people understand design, and very little of the language of design has crept out into the real world. There is so little understanding of design by non-designers, and that's partly because people don't have the language to talk about design. We don't have design counterparts to words like reboot, bandwidth, offline, and beta. They just don't exist. And they certainly, if there are one or two, they certainly don't rival technology's vocabulary in number. And when you lack language, and this is actually something that Natasha said, you really lack the capacity to understand what it is that you're dealing with. So now I'd actually like to ask, how many of you are designers here? Okay, so a majority of the crowd are designers. And I'd also like to ask, how many of you have been able to successfully explain what you do to your mom, right? So this is kind of like a funny question, and we like to joke about it. But I would say, mom's inability to understand, if we just settle for this circumstance, then we're effectively abdicating a huge responsibility and an opportunity to explain design to the rest of the world. By dint of evolution, your mom is predisposed to rooting for you, to trying to understand what it is that you do, predisposed to being your champion. So if you can't explain it to your mom, if you can't get your mom on your side, something is really wrong with the equation. So we're not talking to our moms, right? So who are we talking to? To whom is our discourse aimed? Well, I would say the answer is ourselves. Designers are most comfortable defining design to one another, to initiated peers, to people who already have the vocabulary, to people who already understand the world of design. Now, at this point, I think it's worth noting that March 28th, 2018, this is the first time I've ever met Natasha, just a few hours ago. In some respects, this is surprising because we're both designers. We live here in New York City, and we have plenty of mutual friends, I'm sure. And design is a really small community, right? Most of us, I would say, we're only separated from one another by 1 or 2 degrees. We probably all know each other. The smallness of that community really has profound repercussions, though, on who talks about design. Most of what gets written about design, and certainly most of what gets discussed and what gets read, what gets talked about, it comes from other designers. It's designers talking to other designers. And in some respects, that's a good thing. I mean, it means that the design community just is wonderful about sharing our knowledge, about talking about our process, about helping to push the craft forward. But it also really has its downsides. It's not just that we're insular either, and it's not just that our language is kind of obscure. It's the idea that the smallness of our community compromises our discourse. We all know each other, and if we don't, we might know one another really soon. We might hire someone we know. We might be hired by someone we know. We might pitch business to someone we know. We might sit on a board or be at an event with somebody we might know. We might be on a stage at SVA with somebody we're just about to meet, right? So that familiarity really prevents us from talking openly and honestly. It constrains the discourse. So in some ways, I'm grateful that Natasha and I didn't know one another before this evening, because it makes it easier for me to talk frankly and make honest points. Because we're not friends, though, I do hope that after this we are friends, Natasha. But if you want to take a wait-and-see approach, I totally understand. Yeah, yes. So this lack of independence in design discourse, I think it's really, really problematic if you think about it. Imagine if other art forms worked this way. So imagine Michael Kimmelman, he's architecture critic at the New York Times. Imagine like all the wonderful work that he does, putting architecture in context and helping people understand the importance of architecture. What if he were a practicing architect? What if he were working on a huge project in downtown Manhattan at the same time as he's filing his bylines? It would profoundly change the way we think about what he has to say. It would profoundly change the way we think about his opinions and his influence. In a more populist vein, this is a funny picture of Siskel and Ebert, famous film critics. For years they had this syndicated television show where they came into our living rooms and talked about the current cinema, but they also talked to us about the ideas behind cinema, and they made us all better moviegoers, made us passionate about the ideas behind cinema. But if they were working film directors or producers or screenwriters, their influence would have been much, much less profound, much, much less far-reaching. And this is the situation that design finds itself in today, heavily compromised discourse. I might even argue that in a more ideal world, like Natasha shouldn't be up here tonight giving a lecture in honor of Phil Patton, and certainly I shouldn't be up here on stage. I mean, for all you know, I could be really, really sneakily trying to sell you on Adobe software, right? Who should be up here are independent voices, critics whose job it is to think and talk about and interrogate design and give it context and meaning, and who don't earn their paychecks from practicing design. We don't have a lot of those, though. We just don't have the economic formula to allow for design critics, unfortunately. And as a result, design discourse is really dominated by designers, and I really think that is a major shortcoming of our industry and our craft. And this isn't just about being taken seriously as an art form. It's also about how important it is for designers to contribute what we can do at this very moment in history. So if you Google the term tech backlash, you'll get no shortage of results talking about this really pivotal moment in our relationship as people with the digital world that we've been building for the past few decades. You'll get stories about a real inflection point where people are reconsidering their relationships with Facebook and Twitter and Google. Discussion about all the data that they're compiling about us, and stories about how design or technologies have been so successful in giving us these powerful computers, but yet we're all addicted to them now, and there are some potentially really, really ruinous mental health side effects, and also about how our activity is online, our social activity is effectively being weaponized against us and against democracy. This is a very serious time. The world at large, and maybe even some of you in this room, if you think about these problems at first blush, you may describe them purely as tech problems, but I bet a lot of you, if you think about them a little bit more, you would agree that these are just as much tech problems as they are design problems, and that the solutions need to come, at least in part, from designers. Designers need to participate in these solutions. But if you Google design backlash instead, you'll get none of these stories. You'll get a really disappointing random array of results, a whole bunch of links to pages where the words design and the words backlash just happen to be together, right? So this is funny, and it's also sad. It's as stark an illustration as I can think of to show how little the world understands design. how little it values design, and how little it thinks of design as a critical factor in changing the world. But we all know this is not true, right? Design has a lot to offer. We've been arguing for years about how important design is. We've been passionately arguing for it. We've made some strides, but I think the way we've been arguing has really been counterproductive. You know, our insular discourse, the way we've sort of jealously protected the language and the tools of design, the way we focus so much on the genius designer, you know, these behaviors, they've all worked against us. They've limited us, basically. They've limited our opportunities, the chances we get to contribute to the full extent of our ability. And they've limited our capacity to fulfill design's true potential as the world-changing force that we've all been insisting that it can be. So when I consider design thinking, it really matters less to me whether it leads to a lot of bad design or not. What matters to me is whether it helps broaden the language of design, if it helps expand the community of design, if it helps build a world where people understand design better than they do today. So design thinking, like, sure, it's fine. I have really no quarrel with it. I'd be happy to have, alongside design thinking, I'd be happy to have design feeling too, right? Design sleeping, design eating, bring it on, I'll take it, right? Ultimately, the debates like these, they're really about a simple question, and they're about what do we want design to be? Do we want design to be as small as it is today, an insular community with a really obscure language, or do we want it to be as big and as influential and as inspirational as everybody in this room knows that it can be? Thank you. I see that you've separated us.
I'm in the middle. So thank you both, because there's been no lack of skepticism and I would say points of meeting and then also points of difference. One point of meeting which I just want to open up to both of you is the question of language. It's amazing how you both intersect on language. Do you think the problem which you've both identified with design criticism is that the field is so young compared to the history of art criticism or, you know, or literature? Is it a problem that has to do with the youth of the discipline or something deeper?
I don't think it has to do with the, you know, the age of design relationship to other artistic or, you know, liberal arts disciplines. But I think the problem is rather that we're still talking about design, even like right now, today, as this kind of very generic, amalgamated thing. Whereas in architecture, it's always its own distinct discipline, right? And if you go to museums departments, you have architecture and design. That's just like, that's a universal condition. And actually I find it, I think that it probably is related to a lot of issues that we're having right now, is that you cannot talk about design as a generic thing. We really just can't. For example, you know, graphic design. Again, graphic design I think is a pretty generalized term. You know, if you talk about, okay, typography, say typography is a subset of design, right? But when you think about typography, it is such a nuance and such a specific, you know, field, similar to architecture. It's so specific. It's just operating at a really micro level. And if you tell most people the term typography, they probably can't comprehend what it actually is. They just know that, you know, they have some fonts that they can actually choose, right, from their computers. That's a degree, right, of typography that we're talking about in terms of people's understanding. But then, you know, if you talk about, say, like product design, that itself is this entire different set of language that
is entirely different from typography. So, I think the first thing is to talk about design in a very, very specific sense so that we can actually begin to talk about it or talk about these different subsets, specific subsets. Each is its own big universe, a lot more specifically. That's what I think.
So I think your question was, is the lack of vocabulary a function of how young design is? And I don't think so. I mean, I think the internet is younger than design. So it's not a great excuse. I think it's a function of a lot of things. A lot of things that you mentioned. I think it's some of the things that I would cite are the economic model doesn't really support a really robust discourse the way architecture does. I would say that that people are really, when they think about design or even architecture, they tend to gravitate towards the physical world because it's knowable, it's understandable, you can grab it, and the world of graphic design or product design or any of the variations seems much more intangible, much less knowable, much more subjective.
So let me just try to go to the core of it. I mean, Natasha, what do you think about this argument between the cathedral and the bazaar? Do you think you're in the cathedral and you're protecting design from the hordes without?
Well, depending on, from what angle you're looking at it from, right? A cathedral can be seen from one side, but the other side is actually the bazaar. Again, I think that, the kind of very simple dichotomy of, me versus them, or we versus them. I think that this is not the kind of best model for us to continue our discussion about design, because there's just so much in the middle that is really needs to be defined and needs a lot of clarity. So if you think about just the word, democratization itself, immediately it conjures up really, really positive, right, feeling. But the question is that, does everything need to be democratized? Like, or what needs to be democratized, right? Like, should we democratize plumbing, for example? Probably not, right? Should we democratize dentistry? Probably not. But should we democratize literacy? Absolutely. Should we democratize visual literacy? 100%. Right? So again, once you begin to kind of talk about things very specifically, as opposed to democratizing design, again, design is this big generic thing, right? Should we democratize typography? Yay! I would definitely go for that. I would probably try to figure out how I can actually do that. Actually, I just had an idea. Yeah, that would be a great thing to do. Then I think that the idea of democratization becomes a lot more meaningful as opposed to this generic thing. Should we democratize design? Yeah.
I totally agree with what I said earlier, if that's your question. Yes.
What was that? Remind us.
Well, I actually would say that to add some nuance to my argument earlier, I don't think it's either the cathedral or the bazaar. I think actually it's easily demonstrated that they coexist today. That you have the most valuable company in the world, Apple. They essentially take a cathedralist approach to technology and to design. But then you also have incredibly influential technology like Linux or something like that that is a direct result of the bazaar approach. So I think they're actually not, it's not a binary choice. It's that they can coexist. I just think we just, need to think about the potential of the bazaar model and what it can potentially do for all of us as a profession and as a craft.
Okay. That's a good a good defense. I don't want us to be the cathedral. I think we should open it up to the bizarre. And hopefully there'll be subtleties within that distinction. So if anyone has questions, I think there's a mic that's going to be passed around. Oh, you know what? Oh, is there a mic? Yes.
There's a mic. I don't know. Is it on?
Hi, I'm someone who's practiced design and design thinking, actually more years in design than design thinking. And I'm curious about why we use the worst examples of design thinking to critique it. So, for example, we all see ads on the web to, advertising selling you 3 logos for $50, or we see signage on store windows that have the typography all squished horizontally to make it fit. We've seen ballots that don't work for us. We've seen lots of bad design out there. I'm curious about why we use that as an example. For example, the example of the bad art. I would say, in general, there's a principle in any system. You put shit in, you get shit out. So, if you ask that survey looked terrible, and if you interpret it poorly, you will get that, very averaged, very terrible art. So I'm curious about considering what might design thinking have to offer that we currently aren't considering, and why it has caught on. I'm curious about, why do we think it has caught on? Why is there a public discussion and everyone's sort of trying to take courses about it? And what can we learn from that? Is it that my thought is, why is McKinsey buying up, a company? Why is so many management consulting companies trying to buy up design firms, design thinking firms? Is it that the scale of the problem that design thinking attempts to solve is imagining something bigger than design has traditionally dared to take on? Is it that, in trying to solve these problems that we haven't dared to imagine before, the public feels like, well, we understand what those problems are. We want to know what the future of automobiles is. We want to know, how to engage this community. We want to know how to latch on to some, I think that the scale of problems might be.
I'm going to stop you there because there are
Yeah.
like 16 questions in there.
Okay.
All of them very insightful and helpful. One of them I'm going to try to crystallize. Why does design thinking seem to chime with our moment now, culturally?
I would say there are a lot of upsides to design thinking in that it just offers a different way of approaching problems than non-designers have used traditionally. I think that's huge. I think if we believe so fervently in the power of design, I don't see any downside in other people trying to think the way designers think. And I think it's a tool just like any other tool, and the garbage in, garbage out applies. The fact that some really bad outcomes can result is true, and so is the concept that some really good results can come out is true. It's, for me, the question of what we think about design thinking is a little bit of like, what do you think about the computer? It's sort of like it's not really an issue. It's there. It exists.
Well, I think that, to answer your question, it's too early. I think that it's too early to actually assume that the great value of design thinking based on how much is being acquired, either by consumers or by big firms. Because again, this is the attitude that I was exactly talking about, is that if you're only looking at what's happening right now, even if we look at a very short span of time, say 5 years, right? It's too short a time to actually evaluate and judge something. Best example, the .com boom. During that time, so many design firms, graphic design firms, immediately turn into website design agencies. And I can even name a few that how many of those still exist today, right? And if you think about things more in a historical context, you would become a little bit more skeptical about, the good things as well as the bad things happening around us. That's really the essence, of my talk on design thinking. It's not necessarily saying this is awesome, that is bad. Not that, but it's rather that I think that the value of it still needs to be questioned. And there's very little output that we can actually say, wow, this is really the path that that we can take, as an industry. That's all.
Yes.
I think we have time for one more question.
Oh no, that's a lot of pressure. I cannot believe you two haven't met before, so I want to challenge that. So I think
I've been reading Khoi's
Yeah.
blog for years,
Highly
secret
recommend
admirer
it.
of his writing.
required reading. Thank you both for your presentations. Thank you, Adam. I think we could probably all agree, no matter our feelings on design thinking, that it is insufficient. It's probably useful, but it's not sufficient. But I think what's great about design thinking is that it turns design from a noun into a verb. It's literally in the term design thinking. And so many of us have been arguing for the value of design as a process versus as an artifact that I think it's incredible. I also think that turning design from a noun into a verb is something that Phil Patton would fucking love, so that's my comment.
Thank you.
Wow. Yeah, sure. We're taking the pressure off Alan.
As someone who's not a designer, I'd be curious about what you three think, or you two think, about how design is, of course, buffeted by other fields and other industries. Like, talking about architecture, architects talk about how architecture is being distorted by the media, by the need for pretty pictures to make a bang. I would think that design, too, must be buffeted by the considerations of news media in the same way, or in the desire of businesses for data, that everything should be able to be quantified. So if maybe you would talk about that. Thank you.
Well, it's an interesting question, but I have to say that is really not in my most immediate concern. My concern is always about how our work actually works in the world, and not just from a performative, financial performative point of view, say for commercial projects or for certain brands, but also in terms of does it delight people? Does it inspire people in some way? So I get very encouraged when I actually see comments about not just, oh, this is a great custom type that you did, but somebody actually says that, wow, this is really inspiring to see. And I think that is a really great, it's a purpose to design too, is to inspire, right? So I'm not so worried about that, like in the media landscape, our work, is being skewed or, distorted in any way. That's just bound to happen,
Yeah, I agree with that to some extent. I mean, I'll give a kind of a smart aleck answer. Like, if I see that design is being perverted by the media, actually, I think that's good news. I mean, I think it's just because we just haven't achieved that scale yet. And it highlights an opportunity for us to get on top of our discourse game so that we can help ensure that doesn't happen when we achieve that scale. But it's like, like they say in publicity, like no publicity is actually, I mean, there's no bad publicity. So if there's a design scandal, great. Yeah.
Unfortunately, we're out of time on the note of scandal. I think...
Well done. Well done.
Is design scandal? I don't know. I think, this has shown that there is a language of criticism, and that it's helpful for the design profession, for all you designers out there, as well as people who are writing about design. And there's something, Khoi, that you said, that there doesn't seem to be space right now for independent design critics. And I think that is a problem. And I don't know, I mean, I can give a pitch for our department that we're trying to foster and grow those sorts of voices, and there are a couple of graduates who've gone on to try to carve out that space. But it's encouraging, not to be saccharine, but it's encouraging to see two practitioners who have used subtle discourse, who have thought deeply about the discipline, and maybe this is an initial step towards sort of maturing that conversation, which I hope we will have again, maybe a rematch.
Right?
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.